Okay. Racing forward. We're in the 19th century. Next Tuesday, well, starting Thursday, after you hand in your papers, I'll start talking about the midterm, because it's a week from Thursday. It's a little early because the next paper is due 2 weeks after the midterm, and I didn't want to have everything squashed too much together so that you would go completely insane. I think you noticed from the map quiz it was not exactly overwhelmingly demanding. We just want to make sure of some basics. We will, so next week, your papers are due in class on Thursday. Give it to your TA. So it would be helpful if you came like 5 minutes early and found your TA, or find your TA after class. Yeah, Austin. No. We decided that you do not have to turn in the Mark's paper on turnitin.com. You just give a hard copy to your TA on Thursday, okay? And then Thursday we'll start talking about the midterm. And we will also provide a lot of information about the midterm ahead of time, as we did with the map quiz. Okay, let me start with making this so that you can see it. Not doing everything we would like it to do. Okay, that's better. Okay, I played you a little bit of the wedding march from Mendelssohn, Felix Mendelssohn's music for Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. This brings up a couple of really interesting things about the first half of the 19th century. First, what Marx and Mendelssohn have in common. Marx and Mendelssohn were both from Jewish families that converted to Christianity, which meant in northern Germany to Lutheranism, for a variety of reasons. I don't want to denigrate the beliefs that were involved, but it was the case that if you were Jewish, in the case of Marx's father, who converted, if you were Jewish, you could not hold certain kinds of offices in Germany, where there was not complete equality of rights for Jews until there's the formation of the German state, until later in the 19th century. So it was advantageous to be a Christian if you wanted to get ahead in the bureaucracy. Needless to say, that was meaningless to Marx. How would we characterize Marx's religious beliefs? Was he a pious Lutheran? What would we say he was? He was an atheist, right, okay. He was an atheist. Mendelssohn's father, Moses Mendelssohn, was probably the most famous Jewish writer of the 18th century German language. Moses Mendelssohn wrote extensively about the need to give Jews full rights to participate in political and civic life. So Felix Mendelssohn, his son, was the son of a very, very famous Jewish writer. The family converted by the time it got to the generation of Felix. He was still, however, known as a Jewish composer because of his association with his very famous father. So that's an interesting point about Mendelssohn and Marx. Now, why A Midsummer Night's Dream, the famous wedding march, one that's played in many weddings still today? Because Shakespeare was in great revival in the 18th and 19th century. Okay, Shakespeare becomes a kind of worldwide literary figure in the late 18th and especially the early 19th century. And interestingly, it is the Romantics who revive Shakespeare. They see him as a sign of a national genius for the English, and everyone wants their parallel national genius to go along with Shakespeare. He's just seen as a genius, as an example of genius for Romanticism. Okay, can you see that okay? Konstantinos, can you see the screen okay from the back? Because it seems a little, I don't know, somehow it seems a little faded out today. Okay, this is a map with which you are now deeply familiar. Europe after the Congress of Vienna. Just to give you some background to remind you of what Europe is like after Napoleon falls from power. The Congress of Vienna attempts to restore the old order. But of course, this is impossible because too much has changed. You've seen from reading the Metternich document his views on how change has to be managed. It has to be extremely gradual. That people are agitating for constitutions, that is, for rights, for political rights, and that this is dangerous. This is agitating the masses, and that we need to get control of this. Just to remind you where people are. Louis XVI's brother, Louis XVIII, is restored to the French crown, the French throne, I'm sorry. France becomes a monarchy again in 1815, but with a difference. Louis XVIII must grant a charter, and he calls it a charter because he wants it to be clear that he is giving the Constitution. It's not made by the deputies. It doesn't come from the people. Sovereignty is in the monarchy, but he has to guarantee certain political rights. The rights of property owners of a certain status to vote. There's a two-house legislature on the English model. Essentially, France now has a constitutional monarchy from 1815 to 1848. Metternich, you see, is the chancellor for the Austrian emperor, who is the head of the German Confederation. This is the German Confederation. It has certain similarities to what will be the boundary eventually of Germany, which will not include the Austrian part, but will eventually include all of this until World War I. Marx goes to university in Berlin. He is very much part, he's in the Prussian world, but he's also part of Metternich's world. Growing up as a young man, he will then spend important time in Paris. He will spend some time in Brussels, and he will end his life in London, because England will be the only country that feels it can afford, not monetarily, but politically, to let Marx live there. So ironically, he will live out his life in the home of the capitalism he is in the process of criticizing. Okay? Because everywhere else in Europe, they're too nervous about his association with revolutionary movements. Okay. Now, the second great revolution of the period that we begin with after the French Revolution is the Industrial Revolution. Now, it's not a revolution in the same way because it doesn't take place in 1789. It doesn't have a date associated with it, though it does have a chronology associated with it. I have it here under industrialization, so that we don't have to get bogged down on is it a revolution or is it just a long-term process? Because it is clearly a long-term process that has revolutionary consequences for the life of everyone in the world, for that matter, right up to the present. So what is industrialization? Let's start with some simple definitions. One that's the hardest to get a grasp on is the notion of a continuous rate of growth. Now, don't get me wrong. It doesn't mean there's always a positive rate of growth. One of the things that Marxists, followers of Marx, will seize upon is the fact that there are periodic crises in the development of industrialization and capital formation. There will be a huge one in 1873. There will be a huge one in 1933. There may be a huge one in 2009, 2010. We don't know yet. So it's not to say that there's always growth, but the 18th century ceiling on growth has been broken. Which I mean that before the 18th century, neither the population nor the gross domestic products of countries could continue to grow. There was always a kind of limit on growth because most production was in what we call the subsistence mode. Most people were peasants. in most countries, 80 to 90% in Europe, outside of England and the Dutch Republic, or the Netherlands now, after 1815. 80 to 90% were peasants. Almost all of them, with the exception of maybe 10 to 15% at the top, produced just enough to get by from year to year. There was very little surplus. What industrialization does is make possible surplus that is continually growing and that will eventually outstrip the rate of population growth. Second definition. An incredible change in the nature of work, perhaps the biggest since the invention of agriculture itself. That is the application of steam power to work in place of human and especially animal power. There is a reason that motors are still measured by their horsepower, their equivalency to how many horses would be needed to do this work. Steam instead is used as a power. Steam uses new fuels, not exactly new. Coal had been known before, but it hadn't been used to power steam. Coal is now used in the early period of industrialization right up to the 20th century, indeed even up to World War II, indeed even in some countries now still today. Coal is the prime source of this new power. What does this mean? Who has coal deposits is in better shape than those who do not. One thing this means globally is that Europe, especially Northern Europe, is in especially good shape compared, for example, to Africa and Asia, where the coal deposits are not as great as they are in Northern Europe. Okay, coal instead of wood. This makes it possible with the steam engine to develop an entirely new transportation system. Again, not entirely new. The railroad. The reason railroads are such a mess in the 19th century is because railroads had originally been used to haul coal from the mines to the shipping point, just a few hundred yards. There were little tracks, and you had wagons, and they were pulled by horses. Now you have the invention of the steam engine that will push a locomotive that will pull behind it various cars, including people, starting in the late 1820s, 1830s. And one of the problems is they're still using the gauge of track that they had originally used. When railroads first start, what happens is that every company that builds a railroad uses its own gauge of iron railings, tracks, for the railroad, so they don't match. One of the big things that has to happen at the end of the 19th century is matching the gauges on railroads, and at the end of the 19th century, developing standardized time. Time zones are developed in the 1880s by the railroads in order to be able to coordinate schedules. If it's 8:29 in Boston and 8:49 in Hartford, then it's very hard to arrange a schedule between the two places. You have to have the same time in, not the same, it's a different time in different zones, but it has to be the same for every city in the same zone. Okay, that's going to be one of the eventual problems. The invention of again, the steam engine is not invented by James Watt in 1776. It's perfected by James Watt. It existed since the early 18th century. It could be used to pump water a bit out of coal mines. Watt makes it infinitely more effective. It's used first in coal mines. Eventually, it will be used then in the railroad. And it will also be used to power machinery to weave cotton cloth. This will transform the production of textiles. And it will lead to the rise of the factory system. And this will lead to a new social structure. Who owns the factories? Who works in the factories? And that's one of the things that Marx is talking about, the emergence of this new social structure and the rise of the working class. Just a couple of elements that are important here. in this. Watt's steam engine, which has to do with the way he sets up the condenser system that makes the pistons work more effectively. Stephenson's rocket, developed at the end of the 1820s. It's wonderful to read these descriptions from the early 1830s of the early railroads, because the early railroads are going 12 miles an hour, and everyone is saying, oh my God, you're not going to believe the speed of these objects. It's terrifying. And especially foreign visitors who come to Europe who have never seen a railroad before get into a railroad carriage and are like stunned. The way we only are now if we go to Japan or Europe on the TGV and are in, you know, the incredibly fast trains that other people have where you actually can't really see out the window very easily unless you really concentrate. So this transformed bit by bit the way people could travel, and then most importantly with the rise of the factory, whole families first worked in the factory, women and children worked in the factory because children didn't necessarily go to school, and this led to the rise, as Marx called it, of the working class. Okay, what are the big questions raised by industrialization? One that has aroused the greatest scholarly controversy and that still continues today is, why does this start in England? England, now as opposed to Great Britain. It doesn't start in Wales, and it doesn't start in Scotland, and it certainly doesn't start in Ireland. But in England, in particular, northern England. What's going on in England, which has, by the way, a pitiful population in terms of size of population compared to France or Russia. So it's not the size of your population. It obviously has to do with the wealth per capita. It has to do with natural resources. There's a lot of coal in northern England, but it has to do with a number of other things, which we're going to talk about just very briefly. The important thing for you to remember is that it starts in England in the 1780s. This gives England an advantage over the rest of Europe, economically and technologically, until at least the middle of the 19th century. Now, one of the important things about what's going on here is that industrialization creates a new geopolitical landscape. With the perfection of the steam engine by Watt in 1776, the same year as Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, the same year as the Declaration of Independence, a new element is appearing on the scene, and it becomes clear by 1790 to astute observers, and it's clear by 1800 to everyone, that this is a new type of advantage. At first, the advantage seems to be entirely economic, because what happens in the 1780s is that the steam engine is applied not just to taking water out of coal mines, which makes coal mining much more effective, and you can go deeper and get to deeper veins of coal than ever before, but it is the mechanization of the textile industry. Now you think, okay, who cares about the mechanization of cotton textiles? Well, it means that clothing is much cheaper. And as a result, the money that was used to be spent on clothing can be spent on other things, which means the population has potentially got more disposable income, which means there can be more things produced, and you get a spiral, a feedback effect from this. It also means that the British can produce cotton cloth more cheaply than anyone else, and therefore get the market for cotton cloth in the rest of Europe at the same time. And more importantly, this is not a commodity that they're getting from somewhere else. Well, it is, in the sense that the raw cotton is coming from the colonies in North America and from the Caribbean, and also from India. That's one reason why England is first, is that it has access to colonial markets that produce cotton. It has colonies that produce cotton. So that's it. It has coal. It has inventors. And it has inventors because it has a relatively open scientific establishment. It has lectures for the ordinary population on Newtonian mechanics. Science is spread through all kinds of informal forms of education because no one has universal primary education in this period. No one. Okay? So education is catch as catch can. You have a tutor. You may go to a school for a while. You may even go to secondary school if you're in a certain social class. But for the most part, you have to learn it yourself. Okay? Watt learned it to a certain extent on his own as well, though he had these informal teachers as well. So it's the English social system that's part of it. It's not too rigid. There's a kind of interest in science spread amongst the classes, and you can move. There is social mobility. Watt comes from, he doesn't come from the lower of the lower classes. He comes from a middle-class family in Scotland, moves to Birmingham, and becomes one of the richest people in the country, along with his partner, Matthew Boulton. And they are able to do this even though they are not members of the Anglican, that is the established Church of England. They are dissenters. They are Congregationalists who belong to a dissenting congregation. They could therefore not go to Oxford or Cambridge, but they could go to a Scottish, in the case of Watt, a Scottish university. He went to Glasgow. And you could still make your way in the world because there was that kind of openness. Even before then, England had copied the Dutch in new agricultural techniques, draining of marshlands, enclosing of fields, which caused an enormous amount of controversy in England, the use of new crops, changing the rotation. Agricultural yields were going up, as you know, from the taking measure box in your textbook chapter, and they were going up fastest in England and the Low Countries. As a result, there was more agricultural surplus. You needed fewer people to produce food. That meant there were people available to go into the new forms of work, that is, the factories. So, colonial markets, new markets, social mobility, an emphasis, a kind of evaluation of practical things, that's what we mean by tinkering and practical reason, and science broadly available to the public, taught to the public, valued by the upper classes, and therefore spread more broadly. Okay, so the first thing is, why England in the 1780s? The second big question is, why does Germany, and not France, become the industrial leader on the continent after 1850? Well, Germany doesn't even become a country until 1871, but the German states, and in particular Prussia, become the industrial leaders on the continent after mid-century. Industrialization spreads west to east. We'll get to that in a second when we look at the map. The second big place for industrialization after England is actually Belgium. But Belgium is so small that it is not going to become a massive military power. Prussia has not that many people like England, but it has a big army, and with industrialization going very quickly in northern Germany, it will outstrip France. And this will make Germany the major power on the continent by the end of the 19th century. And from this, all else will follow in 19th and 20th century history. The Germans will defeat the French in 1870, and it will become clear how dominant they are. They will feel undervalued by the other great powers at the end of the 19th century. This will lead to a certain belligerence that contributes to World War I, and we have some idea about World War II already. Now, why does this happen? Germany is not a place of great social mobility. The aristocrats make up the officer corps of the army almost entirely. They dominate over their peasants, who are serfs. Well, first of all, industrialization actually happens first in the parts of Germany that are not under serfdom, that have a peasantry more like that of France and northern Italy. But the difference with France will be that France remains a country in which peasants are able to get along on small plots of land, keep them in the family, divide them up amongst their children even, and maintain the subsistence style of production well into the end of the 19th century. So one will be that the peasantry is independent in France, and in Germany it's independent only in the West, and in the East it's dependent until 1848. Therefore, it does not have land in the same way that the French have land. The French peasantry has the land, it values the land, they don't want to leave the land, and it's a rich enough land that they can stay on the land and make a living. So France continues to have a small peasantry into the 1950s. Okay? One measure of this is urbanization. By 1850, England is 50% urban in population. France becomes 50% urban in population in 1930. So it remains an agricultural country. In a sense, its richness works against industrialization. Peasants can keep going. They have their own land. They do not have an incentive to move to the city in the same way that liberated serfs after 1848 in Germany will have. Okay, the map. The map is in the textbook too, but let's look at it because it makes some very important points. Did you want to share your thoughts with the rest of the class? Because I can actually hear you from down here. Okay. Notice the difference. 1850, still 1850, it's still obvious that England is very much in the lead. Look at between 1830 and 1850, these railroad lines have been built in England. There are a few in Scotland, and the southern part of Scotland is industrializing, which is where Watt comes from in the first place. The area around Glasgow, which has big coal fields, will become a major industrial area. Belgium, you can see why Belgium will become the next source of industrialization. The green is major areas. The little red dots, you can't see them very well, here's one, are areas, oh, here we are, over here, little red dots, where there are Belgian coal fields. Coal fields in western France, main coal fields that are exploited in France are here. Notice that there are coal fields in northern Spain as well, but look at the railroads in Spain in 1850. Do you see them? This and this. Look at the railroads in Italy in 1850. Here and here, all of them in the north. Look at all the railroads in the south. There's one, a little tiny one that goes out of Naples. Similarly, Eastern Europe, although here we have some variation. Okay, France. France by 1850, they know they have to compete with the British, and yet look at the railroads down by the coal fields. Virtually none, except around the industrial center of Lyon. Whereas in Germany, we already have railroads linking what will be parts. This will be the German nation here along this line. So you can see that's where all the railroads are being built for the most part. There are a few in the Austrian Empire and in Eastern Europe, no question about it. There are a few. More than there are, interestingly, Bohemia is going to be more industrialized, for example, than Italy or than Spain until well into the 20th century. That railroad map tells you an enormous amount. By 1870, it will be even more dense, and it will be crucial to the Germans winning the war against the French in 1870 because they will be able to move their troops more quickly to the front lines. Where are the front lines? The front lines are going to be right around here. And the Germans will have an enormous advantage in mobilizing their troops. Okay. That's industrialization. Now let's go on to urbanization. Urbanization is going on in this period. It's partly related to industrialization because people are moving to new cities like Birmingham and Manchester to work in the factories. But it's partly not related to that. It's partly just a function of something that will be true right up to the present of people moving from the countryside to the city because the word somehow gets out that life in the cities offers more opportunities. So part of urbanization is not related to industrialization. And we know that very much from the present. because the biggest cities of the present are not necessarily industrial centers. Yes, Mexico City, of course, has factories and is important for industrialization, but its size is not proportionate to its level of industrialization. It's a magnet to people from the countryside. I mean, this is true, of course, of the great American cities now. People don't move to Los Angeles because of the great factory work that's available here. They don't move to New York for that reason. They move because it offers a kind of different life possibility. That's the word that gets around, at least. So we have just moving to the cities as well as the new industrial cities. Is this the breakdown of rural community, which you've read about a little bit in the textbook? Women who get pregnant now can no longer force the young man to marry them because the family pressure, the young man can just move away. The young man can go to the city and disappear. Is the family breaking down? Is the community breaking down? Well, sometimes communities are providing the place where people go when they immigrate. This is still true. Somalis in this country are in certain communities. There was a great story on the news the other day about the Somali community in Lewiston, Maine. They did not go there for industrial opportunities, needless to say. They went there because some Somalis went to Lewiston, Maine and told other Somalis, this is a good place to come to. So you get a phenomenon that's called chain migration. Somebody from your village goes to Paris, from the Auvergne in central France, and writes back home and says, you know, I've gotten a really pretty good job. Send, you know, my cousin. And they send their cousin. And that's chain migration. You go to places not just because you think it's going to be a good place, but because somebody from your family is already there. How many stories of American life are filled with that story? My grandfather came from the Ukraine in 1905 because his brother had come from the Ukraine a year or two before. They both went to Canada. It was so cold that they moved far south to Minnesota, where it was warmer and more like Ukraine. My grandfather told great stories about how it would be so cold that he would have to sleep on his potatoes at night so that they wouldn't freeze overnight and be inedible the next day. Okay, that's chain migration, my grandfather and his brother. Okay. This made people, and this is going to be one of the big themes of today, this made people more aware of social change. There's industrialization, but there's also urbanization, and there's now a new literature, a literature with which we are still familiar about the problems of the city. It's too crowded. Too many people are living in the same apartment. We still have stories about that, about new immigrants living 15 to a house, 10 to a room. It's overcrowded. That means there's disease. There's prostitution. There's alcohol because people miss home and they drink too much. The problems of the city are being written about in novels, in tracts, by doctors, in government reports. Everyone is becoming aware of the social question. Now, the underlying point here that's so interesting and so important for the long run is that people are now increasingly seeing the social or society, social structure, as the source of meaning in life, as what structures life. So instead of seeing it in religious terms, are you saved, not saved? It's not that people have given up religious terms, but now increasingly people are speaking in the secular terms about the social construction of the way they live. What is the social structure? What's determining the social world we live in? What I'm trying to say here is it is these momentous changes of the early 19th century. Everything seems to be changing that gets people to think about what is going on. What does it mean? And that is the birth of ideology. That is the birth of socialism, that is the birth of communism, and it's the birth of all other ideologies. Along with the French Revolution, these are the two things. Now, an example of the kind of thing that's going on in the social question, it's really about industrialization. I just cannot resist lingering for a second on the Lawaldi because it tells us something about what is happening on these factory rules in Berlin. I just want you to just think about this for a second. The normal working day begins at all seasons at 6 a.m. precisely, and ends after the usual break of half an hour for breakfast, an hour for dinner, and half an hour for tea at 7 p.m., and it shall be strictly observed. Okay, now this was considered not so bad. 13-hour day. Absolutely, precisely regulated. What I want you to notice here, because I'm going to read the next paragraph, is the emergence of time discipline. In the early 19th century, we have the appearance of clocks not just on church towers, which was the only place where public clocks had been displayed before the 19th century. We have the appearance of clocks at the factory. And of course, we will have, during the 19th century, the appearance of the individual timepiece. First, as a separate piece that you wear in your pocket on a chain, and then, eventually, the wristwatch. People's lives are now going to be shaped by a strict observance of the clock. Remember I said, end of the 18th century, the invention of time zones, so that you could calibrate the railroad system. Early 19th century, this is being forced on people. It's not a natural habit. You, if you don't come at 9:30, are late to do your map quiz, and you learn that time discipline is really crucial. But you know this in general because of your class. If you come to your class at 10:30, you've missed the first hour. We are totally into time discipline, right? If you want to be in a chat room, it's at a specific moment. Everything happens at a specific time. This is being forced on the working class as something they must learn. Next paragraph. 5 minutes before the beginning of the stated hours of work, until their actual commencement, a bell shall ring. We used to have that, right? And this we've taken away as a little too grim to ring a bell at the beginning and the end of class. Even when I was a graduate student, we still did that. A bell shall ring and indicate that every worker employed in the concern has to proceed to his place of work in order to start as soon as the bell stops. The doorkeeper shall lock the door punctually at 6 a.m., 8:30 a.m., 1 p.m., and 4:30 p.m. Workers arriving 2 minutes late shall lose half an hour's wages. Whoever is more than 2 minutes late may not start work until after the next break, or at least shall lose his wages until then. This gives you an idea of, we're talking about a kind of obsession with enforcing time discipline on the new working class. So, what were the solutions that were going to be offered? I don't have time to go over them. They're in the textbook. There are a variety of solutions that people were thinking of. Charity, the invention of police forces. They come up police forces are basically established in cities in the early 19th century. Ideology, which we're about to talk about. Revolution, which we're talking about on Thursday. And finally, what we'll try to talk about a little bit next week, grand programs of urban renewal, which start in the 1850s and continue today. Oh, I love this map, so I just have to show it to you. It's a satellite view of Europe that shows you, it gives you an idea about urbanization because it shows you where there are lights at night in Europe. And you can see that there are a lot more lights in Western Europe than there are in Eastern Europe. And notice that other than the coast of northern Africa, there are, of course, in the desert regions of Africa, not many lights because not very urbanized. Okay, the background to Marx and Engels and the whole problem of ideology. Okay, we're only talking about the Communist Manifesto. And we're going to, at this moment, only talk about communism, and I'm going to talk about the general framework of ideology on Thursday. But there's no question that they're responding to the social problems that we have been talking about. The political issues left by the Congress of Vienna, the social problems created by urbanization and industrialization, and trying to make sense of this new economic landscape. I want to remind you of the Punch cartoon in the Lualdi source reader because it shows, it's from the 1840s, it shows brilliantly how the idea that there are class divisions is not invented by Marx. He is responding to an increasing sense that starts in the 1820s and becomes especially acute in the 1840s, that is shared widely, that there are increasing class tensions in this period. Now, what's interesting about Marx and Engels is as I say here, that they have what I call a meta-narrative. What I mean by a meta-narrative is that it's not just a story about what's going on in their time. It's a grand, overarching story about the meaning of human history. Now, what is great about Marx, and what has made him the subject of discussion for a century and a half, is precisely this meta-narrative. And it is the fact that there could be a meta-narrative. It is the fact that Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, and Marx in a variety of other works, is saying we can understand what the course of history means. Now, to have this meta-narrative, Marx, in the first instance, was responding to the philosopher Hegel. I'm afraid I did not write down Hegel, H-E-G-E-L. A philosopher teaching in Berlin who died before Marx was able to go hear his lectures, but Hegel was the rage in Marx's youth. Hegel died in 1832, interestingly, in a cholera epidemic, which you also will read about in the textbook. Marx was involved in the ongoing conversation, effervescence about Hegel. Hegel thought that he had penetrated the meaning of human history, and for him, human history was about the rise of freedom. He codified things that people in the Enlightenment had been thinking in the 18th century, people like Rousseau, that freedom was an essential human quality, and Hegel traced its rise in history. And he identified it with greater self-consciousness. He thought the Germans were especially good at it because of the Lutheran Reformation, because it gave them a sense of conscience, the source of consciousness. And he thought that it was reaching its height in the Prussia of his day, in the early 19th century, freedom within a legal context. So he's very much a product of the German Enlightenment. What Marx gets from Hegel is the notion that human beings can figure out what all of history means. What is it leading towards? The word we would use for this is teleology. I didn't write it down on my slide. You don't need to know it. Teleology meaning there's a telos, meaning there is an end of history. There is a place towards which history is moving. This is the power of Marx's vision. He will explain all of history. So let me give you an example of this. The very first sentence. He starts with, what is the present? A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise, get rid of, this specter. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot. Guizot is the head of the French government. French radicals and German police spies. So he's saying communism is the new thing. But what's interesting is what he goes on to say on the next page, and this is the meta-narrative. He opens. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Now, let me say what's great about Marx's writing. He pulls no punches. He does not start the manifesto by saying, I am going to tell you when you finish reading this manifesto what the meaning of history is. Opening sentence of first section, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. This can be traced through all of history, different forms of class struggle, and now we are in the modern period, the period of modern bourgeois society. Okay, so History has an internal mechanism, a telos, a teleology for him, and it is not just one of progress. This is where Marx differs from the Enlightenment. It is not just one of progress, because what is happening to the working class? It is not doing very well. It is going to be immiserated. It is going to be increasingly miserable. Why is this the case? And this is where the history of all previous societies comes in. Because history is the story of class struggle. And now we have the class struggle of the bourgeoisie against the proletariat, his name for the working class. Middle classes or bourgeoisie against the proletariat. The bourgeoisie, why is it dominant in our period, the modern period? Because it owns the means of production. The shape of society is determined, according to Marx, by the underlying dominant mode of production. In ancient Greece, it was slavery. In the Middle Ages, it was feudalism, lord and serf. In the modern period, it's capitalism, bourgeois employer, and proletarian working class. In each period, there is a duo that is fighting against each other, inevitably, that has to fight against each other. In each period, in a sense, the lower class ends up winning. But now we are going to reach the end of history because the working classes will have a final victory, which will change everything. But keep in mind here, the key fact then for Marx is that the social world is structured by the mode of production, which is, in the modern period, capitalism. Capitalism has replaced feudalism. Therefore, something else will replace capitalism because history tells us that one mode of production gives way to the next. Capitalism will give way to communism, is Marx's prediction about the course of history. Now, capitalism doesn't just fight feudalism. Capitalism replaces feudalism from within. And this will be important to his analysis of capitalism, too. Feudalism doesn't just die out. Feudalism produces eventually towns where people develop different ways of living in the world, different economic solutions. Capitalism emerges out of feudal society. Communism will emerge out of capitalist society. How will this happen? This will happen because with the growth of capitalism, with the growth of the factory system, the working class, and here was one of Marx's few weaknesses, this is where he was wrong, his prediction was that the working class would be increasingly more miserable, increasingly badly treated, because the bourgeois owners of the means of production would have control, and in order to keep their profits up, they would make sure that the working class would be worse and worse off. So there was an inevitable sort of bifurcation, according to Marx. Of course, as we know from modern history, it's been a little more complicated than that. Now, we could say that in periods of crisis, we return to oppressing the working class. Who has to give up the most in an economic crisis? We know pretty clearly that it's the workers who will have to give up the most in the economic crisis, and not those of capitalism. The capitalists in our time will be bailed out, and the workers will not necessarily be. But overall, what was wrong with Marx's prediction is that, in fact, it turned out to be a tension. One of the geniuses of modern capitalism would be that it would produce a political structure that would insist on welfare for those less well off, that would insist on welfare state provisions that would keep the working class from becoming as miserable as Marx predicted it would be. So it turned out to be much more of a tension than what Marx saw. Okay, so already in the third paragraph he says, the modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. So Marx looks at industrialization and he says, what do we have? We have a factory system in which the owners get to make all the decisions. And the workers get to do basically nothing. They get to appear at the factory gates at 6 a.m. and if they're 2 minutes late, they lose a half hour's wages. What's wrong with this system, according to Marx, is that all of the profit goes to the owners. The workers get wages, and they get just enough money to reproduce themselves. Now, it's important to understand that Marx is writing the Communist Manifesto in 1848. Those factory rules were from 1844. It turns out in retrospect, and Marx could not have known this, though he didn't die until 1883, and he developed his views over time. He couldn't see what was going to happen in the late 19th and early 20th century. What Marx didn't realize was that the absolutely most miserable period of industrialization was the opening epochs. Between the 1780s and 1850, we now think from very sophisticated statistical studies, which are recounted in one of the features of your chapter for this week, the standard of living for the working class probably did decline between the 1780s and 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, depending on the country. And after 1850, the standard of living of the workers actually went up. But Marx is writing at the period when, in fact, the working class is in very bad shape. This new group of people moving from the countryside to the factories with no education, no ability to get an education. And let's be clear about what these hours are telling us. These are hours not just for adult men. Children are working in the factories. They are not going to school. Women are working in the factories. They are not staying at home. They are all in the factories for 10 to 14 hours a day. There is no universal, compulsory primary education until later in the 19th century. So people who are looking at the new factories are looking at these crowds of workers coming out of housing in which they're sharing rooms, 4, 6, 8, 10 people to a room. They're walking a mile or two to the factory because it's usually, they're not housed right next to the factory. The factories of this early 19th century are belching smoke that is falling, as the textbook tells you, falling over everything around it. They have steam engines that are being applied to power looms, as most of them are working in textile cotton factories. There is a massive amount of dust created by these first machines in the factory. Massive amounts of dust. Children are employed to go underneath the working looms while they're actually in motion to make sure that no thread is getting stuck and gumming up the works. Okay? There is an unbelievable racket being created inside these factories. The average life expectancy, I think this is in the textbook too, the average life expectancy in Manchester in the early 19th century is 17. Not that people aren't living to be 40, yes they are, but there's such high infant mortality rate because the environmental conditions in these cities are appalling. People have just moved to these cities. Do they have new sewer systems? No. They do not have sewer systems until the 1850s in most cases, and even later. Where do they get their water? They get their water from a fountain down the street. There is no running water in these new cities. There isn't any running water in any cities, for the most part, until after the middle of the 19th century. What are the streets like in these new cities? All of the transportation in the cities in the first half of the 19th century is by horse. What do horses do when they walk around town on the unpaved streets of the new cities or the paved streets of Paris and London? They defecate. Paris at mid-century has 250,000 horses Can you imagine the tonnage of manure that is being produced by 250,000 horses on the street every day? People are employed to pick up horse manure. And where do they take this horse manure in the absence of sewers? Where do you think? Pardon me? Where do you think? Where's the water? No, they don't put it in the fountains. That would be a little insane. That would be just too insane. I mean, they're not crazy. Where do they put this horse manure? The rivers. Guess what? It's really bad to live downstream. You want to live, if you're well off, upstream. And you want to make sure you don't take any water out of the river for any drinking purpose. Okay? So people are not taking baths, except for the lower classes, they're taking a bath a year in the new cities. You have to pay for water. We have to pay for water too, but we don't have to pay that much. And water is brought to you by hand water carriers or on the back of horse-driven carts. So Marx is outraged at what he sees. Engels, after all, had spent his youth in Manchester because his father was a cotton manufacturer with connections in England. He had been inside these factories. And let me tell you, they aren't even as outraged as we would be now because they didn't understand the effect of all that cotton in the air. I have asthma. I would understand instantly the effect of all that cotton dust in the air. But they saw the children, they saw the women, and that is why you see in the Communist Manifesto this level of incredible fury about the way things are. Okay, I want to come back to the fury in just a second, but I want to talk also about my last point, before I get totally carried away on getting into Marx, my last point on what Marx at this point in 1848 is proposing. And my last point being, were their ideas all that crazy? How many of you read the Communist Manifesto in high school? Presumably all of you. No? How many have ever read Marx before? Where did you read him? Oh, you did read him in high school. Okay. So somebody read, you didn't read the Communist Manifesto. What other Marx did you read? Those of you who said yes, you had read Marx before. Yes. Camille. Really? Aha, okay, that's really interesting because, of course, now you understand why the Jewish question for Marx was, you knew this in high school already, was so problematic in his mind, coming from a family that was Jewish and then converted, and he himself is an atheist, and so he's complicated on the subject of the Jewish question. What else did people read from Marx besides on the Jewish question? It's unusual for people to have read that of Marx. That's in the early 1840s. That's considered the early Marx as opposed to the late Marx. No one else read anything else from Marx? What did you read, Austin? Well, okay, so it was a selection from Capital that was about how dialectical materialism works. Okay? Okay, good. Okay, so then it's very important. We should have read the entire Communist Manifesto instead of just a short section. But given what you think of as Marxism and communism, I want to look at what is actually being proposed as the communist program on the last page of what we read for today. In the most advanced countries, the following will be pretty generally applicable. Okay, the first is, of course, the most striking. Abolition of property and land, and application of all rents of land to public purposes. Okay, this is the number one tenet of communism, the abolition of private property. Of course, as we know from the subsequent history of communism, there's an enormous issue about just what form this would take. Did it mean that the government would confiscate the property and set up collective farms, as they did in the Soviet Union? Did it mean that local communes would own land together, which was sometimes true in the Soviet Union, sometimes not? Did it mean that people would own the land or that the state would own the land? What did it mean to abolish private property, which after all had been part of European life since Roman times? There'd always been private property. So how would you actually go about abolishing it? This would be one of the key issues. And this is without question the most radical proposition in Marx. But look at number 2. A heavy progressive or graduated income tax. When did the United States get a graduated income tax? Does anyone know? 1916, right. Okay, 1916, in the course of World War I, when it could be justified because we were desperate for money, and it has been opposed by some people ever since then as socialist. Now you know why. Marx was calling for a graduated income tax, meaning that those who could pay more should pay more. This was the central tenet of socialism, that those who could pay more should pay more, and those who needed more should get more. From each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs, that the better off should be giving money to the state to be used for the less well-off. Now this is now standard in every country basically of the world to have a graduated income tax, and yet in Marx's time this was considered an incredibly radical demand. 3, abolition of all rights of inheritance. Still something that we argue. This is what's so incredible about Marx, is that he gets to the heart of things that we still fight about today. Abolition of all rights of inheritance. How does that apply to the present? How are we arguing about that right now? We do not have the abolition of all rights of inheritance, but what do we have? Estate taxes, exactly. An estate tax is, in a sense, a response to this issue. An estate tax says those who accumulate a lot of wealth should not be able to give all of it to their children. They have to give some of it to the state. And we argue about whether this is right or not. Again, a socialist or communist idea. Confiscation of the property of all immigrants and rebels. This is what the French revolutionaries had done. Centralization of credit in the banks of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. So Marx says no private banks. And here we are arguing about this again. Should we be nationalizing the banks or saving the private banks for private investors? This is an issue right now that Marx is responding to. Centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Again, Europeans have argued about this over the years. They're now in a period of privatization. All the railroads are being privatized. All of the postal services they're thinking of privatizing them. Ours is kind of halfway. Many of them are like ours. Our postal service is not exactly public and not exactly private. We still argue about whether the means of communication should be in the hands of the state or in private hands. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state. The bringing into cultivation of wastelands and the improvement of the soil, generally in accordance with a common plan. This should all be planned. That's what the Soviets would get into. Equal liability of all to work. Establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. Here was a tremendous weakness of Marx. He had this vision that was from the utopian socialists that I'll talk about on Thursday, that everybody could work a certain amount and then everybody would have the same amount of leisure. But he didn't understand, perhaps as much as he might have, the question of incentive. Why would someone want to be part of an industrial army of agriculture? What got people to work, according to the liberals, was an incentive, i.e. profit. Peasants worked because they would get enough off of their land if they worked hard to feed themselves and sell a little to be left over. Marx thought you could just get everybody to be in an industrial army for agriculture. And finally, number 10, free education for all children in public schools. Abolition of children's factory labor in its present form, etc., etc. Those would be absolutely classic demands made not just by communists, but by liberals and radicals all the way through the 19th century until by the end of the 19th century, finally, most European countries would offer free education for all children in public schools. And gradually, over the 19th century, they would abolish children's factory labor in its present form. So we see in Marx this fascinating combination of still radical demands and what were then radical demands that for us are now free public education. This is for us, that's not a communist demand. Yes, what is your name? Ami? Yes? Question? Yes, the idea of a communist society would be that you wouldn't even necessarily have salaries, that everybody would do a certain amount of work, everybody would have the same amount of leisure. The goal was everybody would do a certain amount of work and then you'd get to listen to Beethoven in the evening, and everybody would get to listen to Beethoven, not just the rich, middle, and upper classes. And money was not, that's a very good question though, because it raises the final goal in Marx, the most controversial in some ways, is that in the end, Marx hoped that the state would, as he said, wither away. The state would disappear. There would be no money necessarily, except banks to provide credit for setting up, I guess, new industrial and agricultural armies. Everyone would be paid the same because you wouldn't have better forms of work and worse forms of work. Everybody would do work. Everybody would get the same for it. Everybody would have the same education. Everybody would have the same leisure. There would be, in his words, true equality. Okay, so for Marx, if we take the slogan of the French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, he believed that liberty was just for the middle classes and was used to oppress the lower classes, that fraternity was what was needed, that is, the getting together of the working class to overthrow the middle class, and then true equality would be achieved if fraternity of the workers could overthrow the middle classes and their control of production and their control of the state and institute a communist society which would no longer require a state to make it run. If you have any other further questions about Marx after your discussion sections, email me. See you Thursday.